The hum of the city outside barely reached Ethan Cole's apartment. Inside, it was a different world. A world of stillness, punctuated only by the faint whir of a vintage reel-to-reel recorder and the occasional click of his headphones. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by microphones, audio cables coiled like snakes around him. To anyone else, it might have looked like chaos. But to Ethan, it was order, precision waiting to be captured. At 28, Ethan had already made a name for himself as a sound engineer. Not the flashy music studio kind, but the obsessive, almost monastic kind who chased silence as if it were gold. Perfect silence, he muttered under his breath, adjusting a mix gain knob. Not the absence of sound, the presence of nothing else. Riley, his friend since college, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Dude, you've been at this for hours. You need food. Or water. Or just a break." Ethan didn't look up. "You don't get it. I think I'm close. Closer than ever. The silence isn't just quiet. It's alive." Riley raised an eyebrow. "Alive?" Ethan nodded, almost frantically. "Yeah, you hear things you weren't supposed to. Frequencies too low, too high, subtle enough to feel, not hear. And he paused, adjusting the mic again. "I think I can capture it." 2 minutes. 2 minutes of pure silence. And then, Riley didn't like the way his friend's eyes shone. It wasn't excitement, it was obsession. And then what? Ethan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then we'll find out." The apartment was cramped, a mess of audio gear stacked in every corner. Old microphones, digital recorders, audio interfaces, a laptop glowing faintly with waveform patterns. Ethan positioned the last mic in the center of the room, surrounded by a tangle of stands and cables. The timer on his laptop counted down. 2 o'clock. "Ready?" Riley asked, sensing something in the air that wasn't just anticipation. Ethan pressed record. "Ready." The room fell silent. Not just normal silence, but a thick, almost palpable quiet. The kind that makes you notice your own heartbeat. 2 minutes stretched endlessly. Every creak of the floorboard, every distant siren, every faint tap from the radiator felt amplified, like the world outside had been muted and replaced with nothing. Riley shifted uncomfortably. "It's quiet." Ethan's eyes darted across the monitors, watching the waveforms flatten. "Too quiet," he whispered. "Perfect." 1 minute passed. Ethan's chest rose and fell in rhythm with the timer. Then something, a faint hiss like static, barely audible but present. Ethan froze. He leaned into the headphones, straining. The hiss became a whisper, a voice, almost unintelligible, rising and falling in pitch. Riley's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Ethan didn't answer. His hands trembled slightly as he reached to adjust the gain. But the whispering stopped. The silence returned. 30 seconds left. Ethan's fingers hovered over the record button, his mind racing. The air felt heavier now, the apartment colder. Every shadow seemed darker, deeper. And then, 2:01. A scream shattered the silence. Piercing, human, terrified. The kind of scream that makes your stomach drop and your skin crawl. Ethan fell back from the microphone, clutching his head. Riley ran to him. "Ethan, what happened?" Ethan couldn't speak. His lips moved, but no words came out. Only a faint, strangled noise escaped. The recording still ran on the laptop, capturing every detail. The 2 minutes of silence, followed by a scream so raw it seemed to echo around the apartment itself. Riley picked up the headphones. The silence was perfect, too perfect. And then, just as Ethan had screamed, it played again. Only this time, it felt wrong, distorted, like the scream had been stretched, warped into something unnatural. Ethan trembled. I don't remember screaming like that." His voice was barely audible, as if the silence had stolen some of his courage. The apartment, once cluttered with familiar objects, suddenly felt alien. Shadows shifted in ways they shouldn't. The static on the monitors flickered unnaturally. Something unseen pressed against the edges of the room. Riley backed away, staring at the laptop screen. "Ethan, what did you record?" Ethan swallowed hard, voice shaking. "I don't know, but it wasn't just me. I think it was already there waiting. And in the quiet aftermath, the whispering returned. Not from the recording, not from the equipment, but from the room itself. The days after the recording were a haze for Ethan Cole. He barely slept. When he did, dreams were invaded by the faint hiss he'd heard during those 2 minutes of silence. Voices just beyond comprehension, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. Riley noticed the change immediately. The obsessive energy in Ethan's eyes had deepened into something darker, something unmoored from reality. Ethan didn't answer his phone, didn't leave the apartment for more than a few hours, and when he did, he carried his microphones with him as though they were talismans. "I need to hear it again," he told Riley one evening. "The whispers, they're not random. They're patterns, messages." Riley frowned, leaning against the doorway of Ethan's cluttered apartment. Patterns? Messages? Dude, it was probably just interference. A software glitch. No, Ethan's voice was sharp, unyielding. "I know what I heard. It's intentional. Someone, or something, is trying to reach me." Through silence. That night, Ethan ventured outside with a backpack full of equipment. The streets were quiet, too quiet. Even the usual hum of distant traffic seemed muffled, replaced by an eerie stillness. He tested abandoned buildings first. Empty warehouses where the air smelled of dust and decay. He set microphones in corners, in hallways, pressed record, and waited. Hours passed. Most of the recordings were nothing but faint echoes and environmental noise. But some captured something unusual. A barely audible scratching at the walls, soft thumps, or low-frequency vibrations that seemed almost like breathing. And occasionally, in the back of the tracks, faint whispers, like syllables from a language he had never learned, or maybe one he had only imagined. Ethan replayed each file obsessively, isolating the whispers, slowing them down, looping them. He began to notice subtle repetitions, like someone or something was structuring the sounds. "I think it's calling me," he whispered to himself, staring at the waveform patterns. "I just have to respond." Riley visited a few days later. The apartment had become a shrine to obsession. Microphones stacked like sentinels, wires coiled like snake nests. Every surface covered with laptops and notebooks filled with graphs, symbols, and scribbles in messy handwriting. "You're losing it, Ethan. You've gone too far," Riley said. "This thing isn't real. It's just noise." Ethan didn't answer. He was already recording again. This time, in the corner of his room, the small condenser mic picked up an almost imperceptible vibration in the air. It wasn't the hum of electricity or the street below. It was deliberate, methodical. Hours passed. Riley, frustrated, watched Ethan stare at the audio meters like a man possessed. And then, softly, almost too faint to hear, a whisper emerged through the headphones. "Here." Riley jumped. What the hell was that? Ethan froze. His pale fingers hovered over the controls. "You heard it. It's here. It's real. It's always been here." From that night on, Ethan began sleeping with the microphones. Even in his dreams, the whispers followed him, curling into the corners of his mind, refusing to let him rest. He began leaving small recordings out in public, in parks, in empty subways, in abandoned office buildings, hoping to capture the silence elsewhere. The results were disturbing. Microphones placed in empty subway tunnels sometimes picked up faint human-like footsteps, yet when Ethan returned in person, the tunnels were empty. In one abandoned office, he recorded soft knocks on walls where no one could have been standing. The recordings began to sound less like ambient noise and more like communication. Riley tried to intervene. "You need to stop this, Ethan. You're not hearing it correctly. This is messing with your mind." But Ethan ignored him. His obsession had become a quiet madness. He began spending entire nights in the dark, listening, recording, writing down every sound, no matter how subtle. Even his normal routines disappeared. Meals were forgotten, laundry piled up, the apartment grew colder. And then, small things began happening. Subtle disturbances. A microphone stand toppled without explanation. Notes rearranged themselves. Shadows moved slightly out of sync with their owners. Riley noticed them too, but Ethan dismissed them as his own overactive mind. One night, while reviewing recordings from an abandoned warehouse, Ethan froze. There, buried deep in the static, was something unmistakable, a scream. Not his own, not human. It was long, drawn out, and layered, screaming in multiple frequencies at once. His pulse spiked. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the one. It wants me to hear it again. It wants more." Riley tried to pull him away. "Ethan, don't. Just stop before it gets worse." But Ethan had already begun planning his next recording. 2 minutes again. Longer if needed. Perfect silence, interrupted. Perfectly captured. Ethan's apartment had become a shrine to obsession. Microphones leaned in every corner like sentinels, cables coiled like serpents, and laptops flickered endlessly with waveforms that only he could read. Riley stood in the doorway, hesitant, feeling more like an intruder than a friend. "You really think you can do it?" Riley asked, his voice tight. Ethan didn't answer. He was already adjusting a microphone in the center of the room, placing it on a small tripod with surgical precision. "This is it," he murmured. 2 minutes of pure silence. And then, "We'll know." Riley glanced at the timer on Ethan's laptop. 2 minutes. It didn't seem long, but the air in the apartment was thick, almost suffocating. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. Ethan's breathing was shallow but steady, his eyes locked on the monitors as if they held the answers to the universe. He pressed record. The silence began. At first, it was perfect. A stillness so complete it was almost unbearable. Every tiny sound, the hum of a refrigerator, the soft creak of floorboards, was amplified in their consciousness. Riley could feel the weight of it, as though the room itself was holding its breath. 30 seconds in, Ethan's monitors detected something subtle, a barely noticeable spike in the waveform. A soft hiss, faint, almost imperceptible, but deliberate. Ethan leaned forward, straining to listen. The hiss became a whisper. Riley swallowed hard. "Did you hear that?" Ethan's eyes widened, pupils dilated. Yes, it's here." The whispering grew more distinct. Not words, not language he could understand, but patterns, repeated intonations, almost musical, curling around the edges of the room like smoke. Ethan began jotting down the sequence on a notepad, hands shaking with adrenaline. 1 minute passed. The whispering intensified. Ethan adjusted the microphone's gain, his pulse matching the irregular rhythm of the sound. The temperature in the room dropped. Riley could see his own breath forming faint clouds in the dim light. Ethan's hands hovered over the controls. The monitors displayed spikes in frequency he had never recorded before. Low, guttural vibrations that seemed to penetrate through the floor, through the walls, through everything. And then, at exactly 2:01, a scream tore through the headphones. It wasn't a human scream, or at least not entirely. It was layered, raw, guttural, and yet impossibly distorted. The sound seemed to reverberate through the walls, shaking the apartment like an earthquake. Ethan fell backward, clutching his head, trying to shut out the unimaginable. Riley lunged for him. "Ethan, are you okay?" What was that?" Ethan couldn't speak. He could only stare at the monitors, trembling. His scream, or the thing that had used him as a conduit, still echoed in his mind. The recording continued running, capturing every infinitesimal vibration, every whisper, every distortion. The room grew colder, shadows twisting unnaturally along the walls. Riley noticed the furniture subtly shifting, as if the air itself was pressing against it. The static on the monitors flickered violently, then stabilized, but the waveform displayed something impossible. The screams stretched across multiple frequencies, some so low they made the floor vibrate, some so high they pierced the ears with unbearable sharpness. Ethan whispered, voice trembling. It wasn't just me. It was already here, waiting. Riley stepped back, horror-struck. The whispering returned, now audible to him as well. Words? Maybe. A language beyond comprehension. Each syllable pressed against the edges of his mind, teasing, promising, threatening. Hours later, the recording remained. The audio file looked normal, a flat 2 minutes of silence followed by Ethan's scream, but anyone who played it reported strange phenomena. Faint whispers in empty rooms. Sudden chills. Objects moving subtly out of place. People began calling it the scream that should not exist. Ethan refused to leave the apartment. Sleep had become impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, the whispers returned, curling around him like smoke, rising from the monitors, filling every corner. The recording had changed him, or maybe it had revealed what had been there all along. Riley tried to intervene again. "You have to stop this, Ethan. You don't know what you've unleashed." Ethan looked at him, eyes wild. "I have to finish it. 2 minutes, it's only the beginning. I know now it wants more. And I have to listen." By the end of the night, the apartment had become a chamber of unnatural stillness. Every sound was amplified, distorted, and warped. Even the street outside seemed to quiet itself, as if the world knew not to interfere. And then something moved. Not human, not animal. Something large, fluid, almost liquid in form, gliding across the shadows. Riley saw it for a fraction of a second. Shimmering darkness that stretched impossibly tall and thin before melting back into the shadows. The whispering coalesced into a single sound, resonating in the air. Soon, the scream had ended hours ago, but the apartment did not return to normal. Silence had been broken, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Ethan sat in the center of the room, surrounded by his microphones and laptops, staring at the waveform on the screen like a man possessed. His hands trembled, sweat beading along his brow. Riley paced the room, unease gnawing at him. "Ethan, you can't keep doing this. Whatever it is, it's not just in the recording. It's here." Ethan didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the corner of the room where the shadow had shimmered during the recording. It was gone now, but the feeling remained, like the air itself was watching them. Over the next few days, things escalated. Small objects moved on their own. Microphone stands toppled. Cables snaked across the floor, as if alive, and notes Ethan had meticulously written appeared scattered across the apartment in impossible arrangements. Furniture subtly shifted when no one was in the room, and the faint, cold drafts seemed to follow them. Riley began documenting these disturbances, taking photos and videos on his phone. He wanted proof, evidence that something unnatural was happening. But every time he reviewed the footage, the images seemed warped, shadows bent unnaturally, objects blurred, whispers faintly audible in the background. Ethan became increasingly paranoid. He refused to leave the apartment, sleeping only in short bursts. Headphones clamped over his ears, monitors displaying waveforms that danced and flickered with patterns no human could produce. The whispering grew louder at night, forming words he couldn't comprehend but somehow understood. "Listen, come closer." One evening, Riley returned from a short errand to find the apartment door slightly ajar. Heart racing, he pushed it open. The apartment was colder than before. The lights flickered, and a low hum vibrated through the walls. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. Riley called out, "Ethan, where are you?" Only silence answered, but the microphones were recording. And through the headphones, Riley heard it, a faint, distorted scream layered with whispers, echoing from every corner of the apartment. He followed the sound, careful, stepping over cables and scattered notebooks. The scream grew louder, more urgent. Then he saw it, the laptop screen displaying the waveform from the 2-minute recording. It wasn't just replaying, it was generating new patterns, new screams, and subtle whispers that seemed to reach into his mind. Riley tried to shut it off, pulling the laptop from the table, but it resisted, as if it were welded to the desk. The screen flickered violently. Then, for a brief instant, he saw Ethan's face, not in the room, not in reality, but on the waveform itself. Twisted, screaming, eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into one chilling phrase. "You're next." Riley stumbled backward, heart pounding. The apartment felt impossibly large, shadows stretching into the corners as if alive. The floor vibrated subtly, the hum of unseen machinery, or something else, filling the space. Desperate, Riley fled the apartment, slamming the door behind him. The building itself seemed to react. The lights flickered one last time, and a low, resonant echo followed him down the stairwell, growing fainter but never truly leaving. Outside, the city felt wrong, quieter, muted, as if the scream had pulled something from the world and left only an uneasy stillness behind. Over the next days, Ethan was gone. No friends, no calls, no sign of him anywhere. But the recordings remained. They had been uploaded online, though attempts to download them failed. Users reported hearing the initial silence, then faint whispers, and in some cases, a scream that seemed to echo directly inside their skulls. Some claimed the files reproduced themselves, spreading through devices, never vanishing entirely. Riley, haunted and exhausted, could not forget. Every silent room, every paused moment of stillness seemed to contain it, the presence that had been released. He started hearing whispers even on the street, subtle patterns in ambient noise, things only he could detect. And then, one evening, Riley received an email. No sender, no subject. Inside was a single file. He hesitated, hands trembling. One click later, the headphones on his desk played 2 minutes of silence. He listened. 2:01. A scream tore through the air, and Riley recognized it immediately. It wasn't Ethan's. It was his own. Riley sat frozen in his apartment, headphones clamped over his ears. The silence before the file played was suffocating, heavier than any quiet he had ever known. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart hammering. One click, one moment, and everything would change. He pressed play. The first 2 minutes were silent. Perfect silence. So absolute that he could hear his own blood rushing in his ears. His pulse quickened, every muscle tense. Then, at exactly 2:01, the scream erupted. It wasn't just a scream. It was a living thing. Layered, guttural, impossible, echoing at multiple frequencies. It reverberated through the room, through Riley's skull, twisting perception. His stomach dropped, and he fell back in his chair, covering his ears. And then the whispers returned. Not distant, not faint, but clear. Words that had never been spoken by a human, yet somehow intelligible. Riley felt them burrowing into his mind. You called it. You listened. Now you belong. The monitors on his desk flickered violently. The laptop itself seemed to pulse, breathing like a living creature. And then, the waveform on the screen shifted. It no longer resembled a sound recording. It was him, his own face, twisted in terror, screaming silently, distorted across frequencies he could not comprehend. Riley tried to pull off the headphones, tried to unplug the laptop, but every cable, every connection resisted. It was as if the silence had taken form, bending reality, anchoring itself to him. A shadow moved across the room. Not human, not solid. Fluid, stretching, bending. It leaned toward him, and Riley's instincts screamed to run, but his body refused. He was rooted in place, hypnotized by the unnatural presence. And then a realization hit him. The scream, the recording, it wasn't a scream at all. It was a doorway. It had drawn Ethan first, and now it had drawn him. It fed on the act of listening, on the obsession. And once you heard it, you became a conduit. Riley felt a pull from inside his own mind, like invisible hands dragging him toward the laptop. The whispers grew louder, faster, repeating a pattern that resonated deep in his bones. 2 minutes, then scream, then join, then repeat. His own scream caught in his throat. The sound seemed to split, duplicating itself, echoing endlessly inside his head. Time stretched and folded. The apartment no longer felt like his own. Shadows moved independently. Corners warped impossibly, and the silence between each pulse of sound seemed infinite. Somewhere distant but immediate, he heard Ethan. His friend's scream, layered on top of his own, looping, stretching across frequencies that should have been impossible. Ethan's voice, warped, distorted, whispering words that Riley couldn't understand, but somehow knew were warnings or instructions. The laptop screen flickered one last time. The waveform exploded across all monitors. Riley's own face, screaming, multiplied, filling every inch of the screens. And then everything stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. Riley slumped back, breath ragged. He felt different. Hollow. He glanced around the apartment. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. The shadows had returned to their places. The cold had receded. The whispering was gone. He exhaled slowly. Relief. Maybe it was over. And then his phone buzzed. A new file. No sender, no message. Just the icon of a sound recording. He stared at it. Hands shaking, he picked it up. The timestamp read, 2 minutes. Riley knew, before pressing play, what it would be. He hesitated. A part of him wanted to destroy it, throw it into the street, erase every trace. But curiosity, dangerous, irresistible one. He tapped the play button. The first 2 minutes, silence. Perfect silence. At 2:01, the scream began. But this time, Riley recognized it fully. It was his own. And somewhere in the distance, or perhaps in another apartment, another city, another mind, Ethan's distorted voice whispered back. 2 minutes, then scream, then repeat. The world outside continued, oblivious. But inside, Riley knew it was only beginning. The silence had a life of its own. And now so did he. The scream never ends. Every listener becomes the next conduit. The recordings are endless. Silence itself is no longer innocent. It is alive, hungry, and impossible to escape.